Today, I would like to talk to you about security audits for advanced security. So, when we talk about a security audit, what we are talking about is a way of going through a company's current policies and procedures. We would need internal access to a company, and it gives us the ability to look for any holes or things that need updating. Now, this is not the same thing as a pen test that we talked about earlier. A security audit is done internally within the company where they can go through and look at what's going on and decide if anything needs to be updated. All companies should have a security policy, and an audit should go through that policy very carefully on a frequent basis so that we can make sure everything is still current and up to date. Now, an audit versus a pen test. A pen test is a digital footprint. You are looking for the right authorization to do a pen test, but you don't actually need cooperation from the company as a whole. A pen test is looking at what can be seen from the outside. A security audit is what can be seen from the inside. This is any holes and vulnerabilities from the inside of the company with this insider knowledge. We need cooperation from the company because we're trying to look at what they're doing. So, for example, if we were doing a pen test, we might start looking at how a web server is set up so that we could figure out if they, for example, accidentally posted a password hard coded into the HTML. Now, before you start laughing about that as being ridiculous, this was recorded in 2022, and there was actually a recent news story about that. If you're interested, you can go look it up. A security researcher was actually accused of being a hacker because they right clicked on a website and said, show code. So, anyway, a pen test would be able to do something like look at a website, see if a password was hard coded into the HTML, and see what the digital footprint is of that website. An audit, however, would go through the internals of the company and say, okay, what is our policy on server naming, server access, password controls for the server? What do we do about changing it? What do we do about multi-factor authentication? All of those things. And so that's what an audit would look at versus what a pen test might look at. Now, an audit might look at things in the physical environment. So this can be different depending on the kind of company that we are talking about. We are starting to see more and more companies that have remote workers. Either everybody is remote or at least half the team is remote. But if you have a company that has a physical location, we have to look at that physical location. Who has access to the building? What type of access do they have? How long does this change? If we have servers, who has access to the servers? Part of an audit should be walking through a company if that is an option. You can actually see walking through a company things like people not following policies. So, one of the really common ones that I've seen is people put post-its with passwords on their monitors and under keyboards. I know some people will even put post-its with their passwords on their laptops as they carry them around. By the way, P.S. if this is you, please don't do this. We'll also see things like pages being left in printers and fax machines. Now, at some companies, that might not be that big of a deal, but let's say we worked for a financial company or a healthcare company. That might be somebody's very in-depth medical file that's being left in a printer that anybody could walk past. Are people getting up and leaving computers unlocked? So maybe somebody who has a lot of access to the system has just gotten up and walked away from their computer to go get a cup of coffee, and they left their computer unlocked for anybody to come in. So these are the kinds of things that an audit might be looking at. Now, most companies will also have a shredding policy. And this physical shredding policy of documents, maybe they have shredders come in, maybe they have something even more specific. There's government rules and government third-party contractors might have specific types of shredding that they need done. They might not be okay with regular shredding. They might need something like cross-cut shredding. And so all of those different things will vary depending on the company that we're talking about, but that should be part of your security policy, and an audit should be checking on that for you. Audits should also be checking on the people. They are looking at things like password policies and how are these password policies enforced. Now, one of the things that we have to take into account with this is if these password policies are being enforced, are people getting around them? So, one of the things that I see really commonly is if you have to do, let's say, a new password every 90 days, um, people will just increment the number. So, they'll do things like, summer to fall or spring to summer, things like that, and just update the year or the month or whatever count it is that they happen to have. Now, this does mean if there's some variety of a breach and you know that somebody had a password 22, well, you could probably make some guesses as to how old that password was, what their number might be, and at the very least, that would probably give you some ideas of some places to try for passwords. Now, we might also end up looking at if the company uses knowledge based answers, are they using common information or multi factor authentication? For example, if we use common knowledge based answers, is this really common info? Where did you grow up? What was the name of your first pet? This is also going to sound very similar to those quizzes you'll see going around social media like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. 20 things you might not know about me. And some people will answer them all truthfully and then post them publicly. So these are things that you would need to look at if you have a security audit is what are the rules around this? Are people getting around those rules and how is this being dealt with? Then we have to look at how we are protecting our data. Do we do things like full disk encryption? Are we doing specific files that are highly sensitive? Do we have partitions that happen to be encrypted? What is the security policy saying on that, and are we following it? Do we do third party encryption, PGP encryption? Hopefully, you do not have an in house roll your own style encryption. Those generally do not ever work out well. What about other protected data? Do we have USB drives? Are we allowed to use USB drives? Are we not? Do we have cloud storage? What about our backups? All of those things need to be included in our security policy, and we need to look at them as we are doing our audit for our security policy. Servers need to be their own section of the audit as well. All large companies are going to have some variety of server access for lots of different things. Maybe it's email, maybe it's dev work, maybe it's even chat servers, who knows. Now, in the servers, we have to look at things like what are the config files? Were there changes made? How is it documented that there are changes made? Who has access to that? How often are these changes made? How often is it updated? And how often is the access updated? So all of those things are important because you never want to have, oh yeah, that's the server that only person A is able to get to, and oh well, they retired 2 years ago. Oopsie whoopsie. That's not something that's acceptable. Now we can look at things like server accounts. How do you deal with accounts? Do you have dead accounts? Do you have guest accounts? How often is this checked? So one of the things we might see as part of a traditional security policy is if somebody leaves the company for whatever reason, whether it's retirement, firing, quitting, laid off, whatever, how are we dealing with that? Do we make their account dead as part of when they leave? Do we just turn it into a false shell? Do we remove them from the server? Do we have guest accounts? So, like if we have contractors that are coming in for 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, do they just use guest accounts? All of that should be in the security policy, and we should be checking on that. We should have a policy on the applications and updates on the system. How are those happening? Who has access to that? When are we doing it? That should all be part of our policy, as well as some emergency access for things like patch management and testing. So, one of the things that we've seen really frequently is a lot of issues have been happening where there's been vulnerabilities in the system. The dirty pipe vulnerability, the shell shock vulnerability, the log 4 all of those are things that needed to be patched as soon as possible. So, what does the security policy say about that? And is that actually what's followed? Now, different companies might be large enough that we might have different policies for different areas. Let's say, for example, dev and sales. So let's say we are a successful company that creates, Acme Corporation, and we have a successful application of a roadrunner going across the screen. Now we have a dev policy, and that's going to probably include a lot more internal access to our servers, to our code, to our production environment, to our testing environment, to our QA environment. And all of those things would need to be spelled out in the security policy. What is the minimum access? Who has access to what? How are people added? How do we go about escalating our access? So maybe um, I'm a new intern at the company. I end up having access to maybe the test server. How do I escalate to get access to the production servers? Things like that. However, for sales, maybe I have a different set of things. Maybe I have a different policy where I don't need access to any of those, but I do need access to our customer database, to our server that holds all of our customer accounts, our financial accounts. Maybe I need to send things to accounting and finance. And all of that information would be detailed in the security policy and checked on as well. We're also going to need to worry about things like firewall setups. Do we have an allow list or a deny list? You might also see this referred to as whitelisting and blacklisting. That's not something that is hopefully being done as often, and we're moving more towards allow list or deny list because of the problematic language between whitelisting and blacklisting. Allow list and deny list also is a little bit more self-explanatory for what it does. So our firewall setup as a default, is it allow all or deny all as the default? Where is that documented? Is that still the case? Should it be changed? All of these things should be covered in our policy. Now, there's different types of audits that we could be doing. We could have a company, the pretend company Acme Corporation, perhaps they are doing a self audit. They've decided to go and look in their security policy, make sure everything's still good. Maybe they've hired an outside consultant to come in and have an outside perspective, a fresh set of eyes, so that they can go through and be able to see what's actually going on. Maybe there's some too much politicking happening at the company, so they've hired somebody outside because they know they can't be pressured. They've already signed the contract. They are an outside person doing it, so they have a more unbiased opinion. Now, we might end up, as we are doing our audit, we need to think about compliance. Who are we talking to? And why is this audit being done? So first off, we can think about, why is this audit being done? Is it for compliance and laws? Are we in an industry where we have to be audited, say, annually? Or is this something that the company is deciding to do because they would like to go above and beyond? Or is this something that the company has decided to do because they just think it's useful, or they think they're going to be growing and they want to make sure they're better protected? So those can be reasons why we might decide to do an audit. When we are doing an audit, one of the things that we have to think about is, who are we talking to? And are we observing what's happening, or are we just talking to people? One of the things that happens pretty commonly in most companies is, what you say you do and what you actually do are not necessarily the same. So in a company, let's say Acme Corporation, we might have upper management saying, oh yes, we of course change our passwords every 90 days, and we have a very stringent password policy. You go a couple levels down to the system administrators, and they're like, oh, well, we change our email passwords every 90 days, but that's the only one because that's actually an outdated recommendation, and which, by the way, is actually true. We don't change passwords every 90 days anymore. That's not considered a good thing to do. So we don't do that anymore. We only do that for email as part of our security theater, but that's the only place that we do it in the actual company. And then you get down to the people that are actually logging into the server, and they say, oh yeah, no, I don't think I've changed my password in 3 years. And then you look at their post-it on their monitor, and it says their password is password 1234567 exclamation point. So that's the kind of thing where what one person says is happening, what should be happening, is not necessarily the same thing as what is actually happening. So it's important that you're actually watching what people are doing, not just what they say they're doing, and you're watching what everybody is doing, not just what management is doing. But you do also want to look at what management is doing. Maybe the workers are saying, oh, yeah, well, we have this particular policy. And then by the time you get to management, they're like, oh, yeah, well, that's not for me. And then it turns out that there's emails that are coming in, and all of the workers had to go through phishing training, but upper management didn't because they were at a retreat that day or whatever. So it's important that you are paying attention to all of those different pieces. Now, as part of our security policy, we are likely to have some variety of antivirus mentioned on there. Perhaps it is a global antivirus, perhaps we have a security appliance, perhaps we have multiple appliances from multiple vendors. Um, we also have to think about backups of our antivirus, and all of that information should be part of our policy, and part of our audit should be going in and making sure that that's still valid. If we were a 10-person company 2 years ago, we made the policy and we have a free version of a particular antivirus, and now we are 100 people, and we are, instead of doing $1 million in revenue a year, we are doing $100 million in revenue a year. Well, that's probably going to mean that we should update our security policies. We should maybe have multiple appliances, multiple vendors, multiple backups, and we don't want this to be sort of as informal as it maybe used to be. That's also going to change the type of threats that we're worried about. We, as a small company, might only be worried about general threats, the dirty pipe vulnerability or the shell shock vulnerability or the general spam. But maybe if we are a larger company and we've grown to do, $100 million in business every year, maybe we're worried about APTs or advanced persistent threats, somebody who's actually targeting the company, not just a general sort of shotgun approach. So we want to make sure that we are actually changing our policy, and an audit can help us look at our policy to make sure that it's still relevant. Now, the company policies might end up having things like different policies for desktops versus other hardware, so what the people that are working there are using versus, say, the servers. We might have a particular log management policy, so we have to look at where our logs are they being copied, what's being automated, who's in charge of these policies, who's the alternate on these policies, because we want to make sure that we have somebody whose responsibility it is to take care of all of these things, specifically as part of their job description. Well, it's lovely to be able to say, oh, everybody thinks about this. If everybody is thinking about it and it's not one person's job, you don't have that sort of accountability that you might need to worry about. So, in a larger company, or really any company, there should be, as part of someone's job description, taking care of some of these things. Then we have to think about our red flag policy. Now, at a company, a red flag is basically a concern. So we have to think about what is a red flag to us, who is checking it, who is recording it, and making sure that we go back and make sure that this is still relevant. So let's say, for example, we are a really, really small startup of 3 people. Well, if we are a really, really small startup of 3 people and 2 of them are developers, it is not uncommon for developers to work at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. However, if we get to be a much larger company and we end up having like let's say people all around the world, well, then it wouldn't necessarily be odd to have somebody logging in from somewhere that wasn't the same place as the rest of the company. However, for the small startup example that we were talking about, where there's 3 people, all 3 people are, let's say, based in the United States, well, they probably know each other. They probably know each other well. 2 in the morning might not be a red flag, but a random login from somewhere across the world might be a red flag, especially if there was no prior notification. Whereas in our second larger company, a global company, logging in from somewhere around the world at a random time might not be a red flag, but touching particular pieces of our server might be a red flag. So if we have somebody in sales who's all of a sudden accessing our testing server and seeing some of our new products that haven't been released yet, that might be a red flag, whereas in a startup, it might not be, because at a startup, more people are likely to touch more of the system. The roles aren't siloed as much. So we want to make sure we're also checking to see that the policies are being followed, as well as current and up to date for the company size and type that it is. And performing this audit once a year will allow us to go back and see, is this company policy still the right policy for us? Is this still a valid policy? So, those are all the things that we want to think about when we think about security audits for companies. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a lovely day.